Welcome to 10-Minute Decade, the channel that covers world history 10 years at a time. Each episode focuses on a single country and a single decade, giving you a clear, fast, and detailed picture of how the world was changing. If you are new here, consider subscribing. New episodes are released every week. By the time Japan entered the 1730s, the country had changed profoundly. The excesses of the Genroku age were gone. The chaos of earthquakes, eruptions, and palace scandals had faded into memory. In their place stood a more disciplined, centralized, and self-aware Tokugawa state, shaped above all by one man, Tokugawa Yoshimune. But the 1730s would prove that even the most capable leadership could not control everything. This decade would test Yoshimune's reforms, not in theory, but in blood and hunger. It would bring famine on a national scale, social unrest across multiple regions, and hard moral choices that expose the limits of rational governance. At the same time, it would produce some of the most significant economic and agricultural developments of the entire 18th century. This is the story of Japan from 1730 to 1739, a decade when reform met catastrophe, and when survival itself became the measure of leadership. Imagine Japan in the year 1730. The shogunate is stronger than it was 20 years earlier. Government offices are better organized. Corruption is more closely monitored. Agricultural surveys, tax registers, and population records are increasingly systematic. Yoshimune's insistence on frugality and practicality has reshaped the tone of governance at every level. Yet, beneath this order lies vulnerability. Japan's population has grown steadily, approaching 30 million. Most people still live at the edge of subsistence, dependent on stable rice harvests and predictable weather. A single failed crop can push entire regions into crisis. Yoshimune understands this better than almost anyone. He has spent the previous decade encouraging crop diversification, promoting hardy new plants, and urging domains to maintain grain reserves against future disasters. On paper, Japan is better prepared for catastrophe than ever before, but 1730 opens not with catastrophe, but with commerce. In 1730, the Tokugawa shogunate takes a significant and revealing step. It officially recognizes the Dojima Rice Market in Osaka, appointing government supervisors to monitor trading and collect taxes. The Dojima market had existed informally for decades, but official recognition transforms it into something new. A regulated exchange where rice futures are traded, where merchants buy and sell not physical grain, but contracts for grain not yet harvested. This is, in modern terms, one of the world's earliest commodity futures markets. And its official recognition reveals something important about Yoshimune's pragmatic approach to governance. Where earlier shoguns might have viewed such commercial innovation with suspicion, Yoshimune sees revenue and stability. If merchants are going to trade rice futures regardless, better to supervise them, tax them, and use the market's price signals to understand where shortages are developing. But the recognition of the Dojima market also reflects a paradox at the heart of the decade. Improved agricultural productivity, one of the genuine achievements of the Kyoho reforms, has caused rice prices to fall in the mid-Kyoho period. Farmers who have worked harder and produced more are earning less for their crops. The very success of reform is creating new economic strain at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Then, on August 3rd, 1730, disaster strikes the city of Kyoto. A fire breaks out in the Muromachi district and spreads with the ferocity that wooden Japanese cities always fear. When it finally burns itself out, 3,790 houses have been destroyed. More significantly, over 30,000 looms in the famous Nishijin weaving district, the heart of Japan's silk textile industry, are reduced to ash. Nishijin had been producing the finest silk fabrics in Japan for centuries, supplying the aristocracy, the samurai class, and the great temples and shrines with the elaborate textiles that defined ceremonial life. Its destruction in a single night is an economic and cultural catastrophe. The The shogunate responds by distributing emergency rice to the affected population, a demonstration that the relief mechanisms Yoshimune has built are functional, at least for urban disasters of manageable scale. But a far greater test is coming. In 1732, the warning signs that careful observers had been noting for months become impossible to ignore. Swarms of locusts descend on agricultural communities around the inland sea with a thoroughness that defies description. The insects move through fields of rice with mechanical efficiency, stripping plants bare, leaving behind nothing that can be harvested. Simultaneously, unusually wet summers rot the crops that the locusts miss. Across Kyushu, Shikoku, and the western reaches of Honshu, the rice harvest fails on a scale that has no precedent in living memory. The Kyoho Famine has begun. What follows over the next 2 years is one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in the history of the Edo period. Across western Japan, starvation spreads with the same relentless efficiency as the locusts that caused it. Contemporary accounts describe villages where entire families perish together, found days later by travelers who wonder why smoke is no longer rising from the chimneys. Parents make impossible choices, which children to feed when there is not enough food for all. Bodies appear along roadsides. Disease follows hunger, as it always does. Dysentery and fever sweeping through populations too weakened to resist. In desperate communities, people eat things that are not food. Bark stripped from trees, grass pulled from roadsides, leather boiled into something that might sustain life for another day. News of the scale of the disaster floods into Edo through official channels that struggle to convey the reality of what is happening in the countryside. For Tokugawa Yoshimune, this is the moment of reckoning that his entire reform program has been building toward, and the moment that reveals its limits. He orders emergency measures with characteristic decisiveness. Grain storehouses are opened. Tax burdens are reduced in the worst affected regions. Restrictions on the movement of grain between domains are loosened. Public kitchens are established in some cities to feed the destitute. But relief moves slowly. The same corruption that Yoshimune has spent a decade trying to eliminate siphons off aid before it reaches the people who need it. Some daimyo, terrified of shortages in their own domains, quietly hoard grain rather than releasing it to neighboring regions. Merchants, operating rationally within the commercial framework that Yoshimune himself has encouraged, speculate on scarcity, buying grain cheap in surplus areas and holding it for higher prices rather than moving it quickly to famine zones. Riots erupt across the country. In Osaka, Japan's commercial capital and the city most associated with rice trading, hungry crowds attack the warehouses and offices of rice brokers with a fury that shocks officials who believe the city's commercial sophistication would insulate it from such violence. Guards are deployed. Violence flares. Order teeters on the edge of collapse. And then Yoshimune faces the hardest decision of his reign. His advisors urge him to impose strict price controls on rice across the country. Freeze the price, they argue. Prevent the merchants from profiting from suffering. Save lives now. Yoshimune refuses. His reasoning is cold, rational, and deeply controversial. Artificial price controls, he argues, will destroy the incentive for merchants to move grain at all. If the price is fixed at a level below what the market will bear, merchants will simply hold their stocks rather than sell at a loss. The grain will stay in warehouses while people starve outside them. The supply chain, already fragile, will collapse entirely. Better to allow prices to rise. High prices are brutal for the poor. But high prices also create powerful incentives for merchants to move grain from wherever it exists to wherever it is needed. Let the market work, even in famine. The alternative is worse. The decision is made. Prices rise. The poor suffer terribly. Critics accuse Yoshimune of choosing markets over lives. Some of his most trusted officials beg him to reverse course. He holds firm. Over months, grain begins to move. Incentivized by the prices Yoshimune has refused to suppress, merchants transport rice from surplus regions into famine zones with an efficiency that government distribution could never have matched. The crisis slowly, unevenly, partially eases. Starvation does not end, but it does not consume the entire country. Whether Japan survived the Kyoho famine because of Yoshimune's policies or in spite of them is a question that historians have debated ever since. As the famine slowly loosens its grip in the mid-1730s, Japan begins the long process of recovery, and Yoshimune's government turns its attention to ensuring that such a catastrophe can never happen again. The lessons of the famine are absorbed with characteristic Tokugawa thoroughness. In 1733, Japanese-grown ginseng begins appearing in domestic food markets for the first time. Ginseng had previously been imported at great expense from Korea and China, making it accessible only to the wealthy. Yoshimune had encouraged its domestic cultivation years earlier as part of his broader agricultural diversification program. And now, in the aftermath of famine, the sight of homegrown ginseng in ordinary markets carries a symbolic weight beyond its practical value. Japan is becoming more self-sufficient, less dependent on imported remedies, more capable of feeding and healing its own population. Then, in 1735, sweet potatoes are formally introduced into the Japanese diet on a widespread basis. Yoshimune had been investigating foreign crop varieties for years, understanding that rice, the foundation of the Japanese agricultural economy, was dangerously vulnerable to the kind of weather disruptions and insect swarms that had just devastated the country. Sweet potatoes grow in poor soil, resist drought, and produce reliable yields even in difficult conditions. Their introduction into widespread cultivation is one of the most practically significant agricultural decisions of the entire Edo period. A quiet intervention that will save lives in future famines that Yoshimune will never live to see. In 1736, the era name changes to Genbun, meaning original civility, marking the enthronement of Emperor Sakuramachi and signaling a desire for renewal after the suffering of the Kyoho years. The shogunate uses the occasion to implement a significant currency reform, issuing an edict declaring that henceforth the sole authorized copper coinage across the empire will bear the character bun, the same character that appears in the new era name. It is a deliberate symbolic alignment of monetary policy with the spirit of the new era, order, clarity, and fresh beginnings. In 1737, a comet appears in the western sky and is observed across Japan for several nights. In a society still deeply attuned to cosmological signs, its appearance prompts the usual mixture of scholarly interest and popular anxiety. After a decade of famine, fire, and suffering, people are primed to read meaning into unusual natural phenomena. The comet passes without incident, but its appearance captures something real about the psychological atmosphere of a country that has survived catastrophe and is not yet certain the worst is behind it. In 1738, Emperor Sakuramachi performs the ancient Daijo Sai, the esoteric Shinto rituals of imperial enthronement, ceremonies so old and so elaborate that their performance is itself a statement about continuity and legitimacy. In a decade when the foundations of governance have been tested severely, the performance of ancient ritual carries reassurance that transcends politics. And then, in 1739, the decade closes with a story that reveals something unexpected about the man who has governed Japan through all of it. Inside Edo Castle, a samurai named Hosokawa Echu no Kami of Higo is killed by another samurai, Itakura Katsukane. The circumstances of the killing are not entirely clear from the historical record, but the legal consequence is straightforward. Itakura has committed a killing inside the shogun's castle. Under the rigid laws of the Tokugawa system, this is a capital offense. He is ordered to commit suicide as just punishment. But then something unexpected happens. Tokugawa Yoshimune personally intervenes. Not to save Itakura. The man must still face consequences for his act. But Yoshimune acts to mitigate the punishment that would otherwise fall on Itakura's family and his Fudai domain. Under normal Tokugawa law, the disgrace of a retainer could cascade down through his entire household, destroying the livelihoods of people who had nothing to do with the killing. Yoshimune steps in to prevent this. It is a small moment in the sweep of a decade, defined by famine, fire, and economic crisis, but it is revealing. The same man who refused to impose price controls during the famine, who held firm while the poor suffered, who chose market efficiency over immediate compassion. This same man personally intervenes to protect an innocent family from the mechanical operation of his own legal system. It suggests a leader more complex than either his admirers or his critics have allowed, not cold, not indifferent, but possessed of a particular kind of moral intelligence, the ability to distinguish between the principles that must hold firm and the cases where human judgment must override rigid rule. The years 1730 to 1739 were among the most demanding of the Edo period. The recognition of the Dojima Rice Market had revealed the sophistication of Japan's commercial economy. The Nishijin fire had demonstrated the fragility of even its greatest industries. The Kyoho Famine had tested the shogunate's capacity for crisis management and forced its greatest leader into the hardest decision of his reign. The introduction of sweet potatoes and domestic ginseng had quietly strengthened Japan's agricultural resilience, and the currency reforms of the Genbun era had restored a measure of monetary confidence after years of instability. If the 1720s were about building order, the 1730s were about discovering its limit and finding, in the discovery, a deeper and more honest understanding of what governance actually requires. Japan endured, scarred, humbled, and stronger in its understanding of itself and its limits. That brings us to the end of Japan 1730 to 1739. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a comment below. It helps the channel enormously. The next episode covers Japan from 1740 to 1749, a decade of cautious recovery, the quiet fading of the Reform era, and the retirement of one of the most consequential leaders in Tokugawa history. We will see you there.